So if you spend any time at all reading the global financial news, you cannot escape the narrative.
No, you can't.
It's this constant storyline that China's economy is slowing down, that it's facing this massive property crisis, and, a huge financial failure is basically right around the corner.
It absolutely is. And honestly, if you only track the headlines, you'd believe it. A lot of the surface indicators, they look weak, they look stressed. Some are outright worrisome.
But that's the thing. Those are just the symptoms, aren't they?
Exactly.
Our mission for this deep dive is to try and move beyond that panic, beyond the immediate reaction. We want to examine the structure of what's really happening, because what we're seeing might be less of a sudden crisis in the way we usually think of it, and more of a fundamental, deliberate structural overhaul, almost like a total economic OS change.
That framing is, I think, essential. While, yes, economic activity is low and the growth figures are challenging, the overall picture demands a much more nuanced interpretation. We're watching a deliberate transition.
So not just an accident.
Not just a massive economy hitting a cyclical speed bump. This is an intentional and probably painful redesign of its core operating software.
Okay, so to set the stage for everyone, let's start with those pain points. For anyone listening who's trying to separate the fact from the panic, what are the core pressures all converging right now that are feeding this collapse narrative?
Well, we really see four major pressure points acting together.
Okay.
First, there's the ongoing long-term stagnation in the property market. This isn't just a cooling off, it's a structural freezing of the sector that drove growth for decades.
Right.
And second, directly related to that, are the severe fiscal constraints that are hitting local governments.
Because they relied on land sales. Right.
They relied almost entirely on land transfer fees for their income, and that revenue source is just dramatically dried up.
That specific link is so critical. Local governments are basically fiscally starved because that property engine just stalled out.
Exactly. Then third, we have the persistent and, I think, disappointing for Beijing slowdown in consumption recovery after the pandemic.
People just aren't spending.
Consumers are very cautious. They're preferring to save rather than spend, and that's creating a deep drag on domestic demand.
And the fourth point.
The fourth, which is becoming more and more visible, is credit instability. And it's showing up specifically within state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and these quasi-state entities.
The ones that were supposed to be completely safe.
The very firms that historically carried that ironclad, implicit guarantee from the government.
Okay, let's unpack that immediately. Because those four factors, a frozen property sector, local governments out of cash, consumers not spending, and state-backed firms showing, in any other major economy, that checklist would signal an imminent, massive systemic collapse.
It would be flashing red lights everywhere.
So what makes this deeper than just a normal recession? Why aren't these issues just being solved by the typical playbook of, lowering interest rates and unleashing massive stimulus?
Because they defy those simple cyclical explanations. A standard recession, you can often fix it with stimulus because the underlying structure is sound. The problem is just a temporary lack of demand.
And Here,
the government has tried stimulus, and it just hasn't worked effectively. And the reason is that the issues are structural. They're rooted in the old growth model that has simply reached its limit. This persistence, combined with the lack of a systemic contagion, points toward a deliberate policy choice.
A choice to do what?
To manage stability and transition, even if that means prolonged economic pain.
That brings us to the crucial question then. If all those debt pressures are converging everywhere, property, local governments, corporate debt, why are we not seeing a massive financial crisis? Where is the global contagion that would be, inevitable in the US or Europe under this kind of stress?
This is where that structural interpretation really shines. Because when you look at the observable facts, they absolutely defy the simple collapse narrative. The key observation is that there have been no large-scale chained financial defaults.
No domino effect.
Right, there's no contagion spreading across sectors. The fire's being contained, even though it's still burning very hot in specific areas.
So the state isn't preventing failures entirely. It's just preventing them from spreading.
Precisely. When highly leveraged entities fail, and they are failing, they are immediately managed and contained, often in very opaque ways. This prevents the panic from leaking into the broader banking system.
I see.
So the default of a huge property developer is treated as, say, a construction problem or a localized asset issue, not an instant trigger for a banking panic.
That sounds like an enormously expensive and resource-intensive strategy. It feels less like crisis prevention and more like the state choosing to put the whole system into a kind of controlled stagnation.
It is.
So how can we be so confident calling this a deliberate overhaul and not just a controlled slow-motion decline where they're just delaying the inevitable?
That's a fundamental question, and the difference really lies in the strategy's goal. A decline is passive, an overhaul is active, and the third observation confirms this. The state is maintaining this highly complicated status quo.
How so?
It's a mix of extension of loans, restructuring of debt, and the intentional shrinking of certain entities, rather than sudden, chaotic liquidations.
So managed failures.
Exactly. When you see controlled failure and managed stasis instead of a full-scale liquidity injection to restore high growth, it signals the leadership is operating less in an emergency crisis response mode and more in a mode of deliberate institutional transition. They are choosing stability management over growth restoration.
So it's their acceptance of low growth as the cost of systemic safety that really tells the story.
Absolutely. The engine is being dismantled, and that process is messy and it's slow, but it's fundamentally a shift to an economic operation model that is no longer predicated on restoring those previous decades of high debt-fueled growth.
Okay, so this is where we get into the guts of this economic OS change. If the objective of the economy has changed, if the main goal isn't just high growth anymore, what's replacing it? What kind of structural shift are we actually talking about?
To understand the new system, we have to look at the old one. The old model was built on 3 pillars that were all linked together.
Okay.
1, the demand for high growth. 2, continuous credit creation that was centered on land and property. And 3, crucially, the state's implicit promise of an ultimate guarantee for almost anything with a state affiliation. It was an operating system designed purely for aggressive scaling.
And now that OS has hit its hard limit, it's like a massive startup that suddenly realized it can no longer borrow money endlessly just to scale up, hoping market share will eventually cover the costs.
That analogy is perfect. The system isn't collapsing, it's engaging in this necessary self-limiting redesign. And the core change here is the redefinition of credit itself.
What do you mean?
In the old system, credit was an object to be expanded. You just pushed money out, assumed 10% growth would validate the loan later, and relied on rising property values as collateral.
And now?
Now, credit is being treated as an object to be managed and allocated.
That is a seismic shift in economic philosophy. If credit is being strictly managed instead of just expanded, then the focus shifts away from growth metrics entirely. The government is moving from a growth at all costs mindset to something more like a capital preservation mindset.
That's exactly right. This change means the whole economic focus shifts away from the traditional metrics we all track, like maximizing the annual GDP growth rate or demanding broad stimulus to boost immediate demand.
Right.
Instead, the focus becomes this painful, detailed, institutional redesign of the credit system itself. Who gets the credit and under what new, much stricter conditions.
Which leads directly to the new questions that are defining this whole phase. These are the questions that will determine the winners and losers of the next decade in China. What are those central questions being worked out right now?
Well, the current stasis we're seeing is basically the answer to these questions being written in real time. The first one is fundamental. Who bears the final financial losses?
The ultimate question.
Right. Is the central government going to take the loss from a failed SOE? Is a local government allowed to shift its bad debt onto consumers or creditors? This is all about determining the hierarchy of pain.
And the second question, which I think is the most critical one for global investors, is about that implicit guarantee you mentioned.
Absolutely. The second question is, how reliable is the claim of being state-owned? Where exactly does that ultimate state guarantee actually stop?
Because historically, it was assumed to be limitless.
It was. If a firm had a Chinese government entity on its letterhead, investors assumed absolute safety. Now we're seeing the central government allow provincial and municipal SOEs to experience severe distress, even default.
Wow.
That guarantee is being redefined. It's moving from an assumption of safety for all state affiliates to safety only for those deemed nationally strategic or tied directly to the central balance sheet.
The moment that guarantee is tested, the entire risk model for any outside investment just changes completely. You can no longer treat all state-affiliated debt as if it's sovereign debt.
That's the entire point of the redesign. It forces market discipline back into a system that had basically outsourced it to that implicit guarantee.
Okay, so what's the third question?
The third one follows from that, which will be prioritized market valuation or state adjustment. Will the market be allowed to clear asset values quickly, which means sharp, immediate losses but a faster reallocation of capital?
Yeah.
Or will the state continue to intervene to maintain a managed, slower pace of adjustment, prolonging the pain to prevent that contagion we talked about?
And the evidence so far seems to be overwhelmingly in favor of state adjustment and managed stasis, even if it means years of stagnation.
Correct. The current feeling of economic slowness, that stagnation we all observe, is simply the necessary side effect of this fundamental transition in the credit system. They're choosing institutional stability over a rapid recovery.
They're accepting the slow growth in exchange for avoiding systemic chaos.
That's the trade-off.
Okay, that provides incredible clarity for understanding China internally.
Yeah.
But let's broaden the scope a bit. Is this problem where decades of growth can no longer justify new credit? Is this a uniquely Chinese dilemma, or is this a reflection of a bigger global trend?
What's fascinating here is that this structural shift is not isolated at all. China is dealing with it on a colossal scale. But the fundamental limit of that model where growth justifies credit is emerging globally.
Just in different forms.
Exactly, in different forms that fit the operational system of that specific country.
Can you give us an example? Where else can we see this kind of transition in credit management?
Well, look at Japan. Japan demonstrates a kind of long-term economic management that has essentially been focused on freezing and maintaining its existing credit structure under conditions of zero growth for decades now. Their system is all about extending the lives of existing, often non-productive entities and preventing sudden losses from triggering a chain reaction. It's managed stasis through ultra-low interest rates. A different flavor of credit control, but it's fundamentally aimed at stability over growth.
So Japan shows us one possible long-term outcome of choosing management over expansion. What about Europe?
In Europe, we see the issue showing up as a political allocation problem. Credit judgment is becoming more and more politicized, especially around public debt, energy infrastructure, and other state-backed projects.
I see.
Deciding whether certain debts are good or bad is increasingly a political function, not a purely market-based one. This is especially true when you're determining which regions or industries get state backing for huge transitions, like green energy.
That makes China's situation feel less like a singular national failure and more like an advanced, highly centralized case study in confronting a global economic inflection point.
That's a great way to put it.
They just got to the end of the easy credit era faster and with more centralized control than anyone else.
Exactly. The global implication is that China is simply the place where this structural change, the end of easy growth-justified credit, has been most quickly and explicitly visualized compared to other major economies. We're watching an early log of the structural challenges the rest of the world is going to have to grapple with.
So what does this all mean for us? The conclusion seems pretty clear. China's economy isn't just weakening, it's aggressively changing its operational system. It's shifting from a growth-obsessed credit expansion system to a strictly defined credit management system.
That is the core conclusion. We are observing a structural transition. It's forcing this deep institutional rescaffolding. It is not a failure or a collapse in the classic uncontrolled sense.
And it's a preview of coming attractions.
It serves as a precursor or an early warning system for the structural changes the rest of the world will inevitably face as this era of easy, growth-justified credit comes to an end for everyone.
And that leads us directly to the final provocative thought we want to leave you with today. If the focus is now shifting to who bears the final loss, and that requires redefining these implicit guarantees in China, what are the implications for global investors who have relied on the perceived safety of state-affiliated entities everywhere?
It's a huge question.
Right. If the ultimate state guarantee is being tested and pulled back in China, the ultimate centrally controlled economy, which other global institutions, the ones long viewed as implicitly safe, might be next? Whether they're quasi-state banks, national champions, or even public-private partnerships in other major economies. Who else might see their underlying credit model exposed to these hard questions of ultimate liability? Something to think about as you realize the rules of global credit are being rewritten right in front of us.